Hello, I'm Sherry Werb, Director of the Center for Learning, Literacy, and Engagement. Have you ever wondered how books written in foreign languages make it into the hands of English language audiences? What does it take to bring the unique world of a book into another language? Well, I'm happy to tell you about this evening's program because it marks the premiere of another in our series we call Behind the Book. In the past, we have featured great American editors, publishers, and the authors whose books they have shaped into literary classics. Now, we are featuring one of the great American translators with one of the world's most renowned writers. Great American translator Edith Grossman will be in conversation with Peruvian author and Nobel Prize in Literature winner Mario Vargas Llosa, whose books in the original Spanish she has translated for English speakers everywhere. They will be joined by the library's former literary director, Marie Arana, herself a writer of great repute. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm absolutely thrilled to be back at the Library of Congress and joining you for this very special program, the first of a brand new series honoring great American translators. And I'm even more thrilled that the first translator to be honored in this way is Edith Grossman, a virtuoso of the form whom I've admired and been fortunate enough to know for decades. But this program promises to be even more rewarding for yet another great. We are joined this evening by Mario Vargas Llosa, one of the great literary masters of our time, a fellow native Peruvian whom I'm proud to count as a friend. Edith, Mario, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us in the celebration of Edith's extraordinary career.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you.
I want to start by giving our viewers a very brief introduction to both of you. So let me start with Edith. For 50 years now, Edith Grossman has been tearing down walls and opening universes for English language readers by producing magnificent translations of works by Spanish language writers. Among those writers are two groundbreaking Nobel laureates, Mario Vargas Llosa and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as well as the world's very first modern novelist, Miguel de Cervantes. Edith's list of published works is a veritable cavalcade of masterworks, from Don Quixote, originally published in Madrid at the dawn of the 17th century, to Mario's novel published in English just a few years ago, Cinco Esquinas, The Neighborhood. Among Edie's many feats of translation are Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, News of a Kidnapping, The General in His Labyrinth, Of Love and Other Demons, Vargas Llosa's Death in the Andes, The Feast of the Goat, The Notebooks of Don Rigoberto, and The Discreet Hero. And there's also poetry of Ariel Dorfman and memorable novels by, among so many others, Álvaro Mutis, Mayra Montero, Antonio Muñoz Molina, and Carmen Laforet. Her career has won her numerous awards, including the PEN Ralph Mannheim Medal for Translation, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, and the Officer's Cross of the Order of Civil Merit awarded by King Felipe VI of Spain. Mario Vargas Llosa, or I should say the first Marquis of Vargas Llosa, really needs no translation. No introduction. Needs translation, but no introduction. As a renowned novelist, journalist, essayist, playwright, professor, presidential candidate, and Nobel laureate, Mario has had more international impact than any other Latin American writer of his generation. His work is wildly various and prolific, straddling an array of genre. He has written historical novels such as The War of the End of the World, as well as comedies such as Captain Pantoja and the Special Service, or even deeply analytical novels such as Conversations in the Cathedral. But he's also written murder mysteries, political thrillers, erotic novels, and trenchant works of literary criticism. A number of his narratives, among them Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter, have been made into films. Apart from the Nobel, he has won a stunning number of prizes, far too many to mention here, but I'll cite just a few: the Premio Planeta, the Miguel de Cervantes Prize, the PEN Nabokov Award, the French Legion of Honor, the Romulo Gallegos Prize. 10 years ago, Mario was raised into the Spanish nobility by King Juan Carlos I with a hereditary title of Marqués de Vargas Llosa. And in 2016, the Library of Congress proclaimed him a living legend. We're very fortunate to have him with us this evening to tell us about his experiences working with Edith Grossman. So Mario, let me start with you. How did the relationship between you and Edie begin? And give us some thoughts about your work with her in general.
Well, thank you very much for this extremely kind presentation. I think the first time I heard about Edith was in 1995 or 1996. Gregory Rabassa, my previous translator, was quite ill at that time, and so she couldn't do my new novel. And so my publisher proposed me a different kind of translators, I think 2 translators. And the first translator that I read, it was Edith. And so I decided immediately that she was the one, that she was a perfect translator. And so it was like that Edith translated my first novel in my new publisher that was at that time, well, the publisher that I have had until now. Huh?
So and, that was Death in the Andes, I think, was it?
That's right, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, it was like that. Lituma en los Andes, that's all right, yes. When we start to exchange letters with Edith, I think the understanding was immediate. I respected very, very much the way in which Edith managed to identify with the text, the original text, and I thought immediately that her versions of the novel in English were, I wouldn't say perfect, but precise, and that it was something that it didn't seem to be a translation of the novel, but something that had been written originally in English. And I think this is the major achievement of a translator, to give the impression that this is not a translation, but something that has been written in the foreign language directly.
Yeah, absolutely. Not
the merits of Edith, the way in which he managed to translate is something that doesn't seem to be a translation, and I think it is very, very curious, but because a translator can be a very great writer, but not a very good translator, and I think that when you have a strong personality, a literary personality, you are not necessarily a very good translator, because if your personality is something that is present in the language, so you must be in a certain sense a failure as a translator. But my impression is that Edith has this extraordinary and very rare quality of a translator, that she disappears in the language in which she translates a foreign book. Her English is something that it seems to be, because I think it's different, but it seems to be transparent, exactly as if the Spanish language text would be present all the time in the translation.
It's an amazing talent. It's an extraordinary talent. The fidelity that you speak of, which is fidelity not only to the words and the language, but to the spirit and to the actual soul of the book that she's engaged with. Edie, tell us a little bit about how this began for you. Tell us about, first of all, where were you born? How did you grow up? How did you fall into this profession? How did it begin for you?
I was born in Philadelphia, known as the most boring city in the United States. And I went to public school, and I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I stayed there. I did a BA there, an MA there, started to do a PhD there, and then I had enough of Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania, and I went to California, to the University of California in Berkeley, and I finished a doctorate in Berkeley. What else did you want to know? How did I get started? In a very strange way. A friend of mine, Ronald Krisk, was editing a magazine called Review, which was the publication of what used to be known as the Center for Inter-American Relations. And one day he called me and said, Edie, I would like you to translate a piece by Macedonio Fernandez. Mm-hmm. I said, Ronald, I'm not a translator, I'm a critic. He said, you can call yourself whatever you like, just do the damn piece. And so I said, all right, I will. And I discovered that I loved the work. I loved it. First of all, I didn't have to get dressed to go outside. I could be in my sweatshirt. Secondly, I used to smoke. I could smoke like a chimney and nobody would tell me to put out my cigarette. And so I was very happy sitting at my computer and smoking and translating, listening to the voice in my head. Because when I read, there's a voice in my mind that speaks the words that I'm reading. And so that's the voice I listen to when I translate.
You were drawn to literature, obviously, from the very beginning. And how did that begin for you? What was it about stories and words that fascinated you from the very beginning?
Just what you said, they were stories and words. Words are fascinating to me, and stories are wonderful. We live by stories, don't we? Every child wants to hear stories. And we as adults want to hear stories. We want to read stories. We want to see stories. We go to the movies. We watch television. We listen to the radio. Stories matter enormously to us. And whether they're traditional stories out of mythology or stories that are made up like geniuses like Mario, it doesn't matter. The stories are important to us as human beings.
May I ask you a question, Edith?
Yeah, sure.
How was that you discovered Spanish? Why you learn Spanish?
Well, the truth, Mario, is that I hated school. I hated being in school. And the only teacher I could tolerate was a Spanish teacher. Uh-huh. And I remember very clearly saying to myself, whatever that, excuse me, whatever that woman does, I'm going to do. And that's why I went into Spanish. Because she was the kind woman.
Uh-huh. Did you ever thought of yourself as a translator? Because my impression is that very few translators think of themselves as translators. They are accidents in their lives that push them in the direction of translation. But my impression is that it's very rare that someone chooses to be a translator since the beginning, since young.
Yeah, no, I never thought of myself as a translator. I thought I would be a scholar. I thought I would be an academic, that I would be doing great things in the Spanish Renaissance and, you know, discovering yet another poem by Góngora. And I thought that's what I would do. But translation was wonderful. When I began to do that, I thought I like this more than research, and I like it more than scholarship.
That says to me that, you know, you as a translator, as a scholar, you're looking at literature. As a translator, you are looking at literature, but also entering it. And the entering it is interesting to me, because that says to me that you're naturally a writer, that you had the writer in you. And it makes me want to ask if you were writing stories yourself, and if you were imagining those worlds yourself.
Well, I wrote a couple of stories when I was very young, but I'm a failed poet. I've written lots of poetry, which I keep in a drawer. And I look at it from time to time, and I think, oh, well, most of this is not very good. A couple of poems I like. And so that was in me.
So
I'm
you
a great admirer of translators, because I think you must be extremely generous to be a very good translator, because if you have a strong literary personality, you cannot be a very successful translator. I think that a real translator is someone who is able to renounce of this personality in order to be a very effective servitor of the original that you translate into English. And this, I think, is very incompatible with what writers used to be, usually are.
Well, I always thought of myself as someone with a huge ego. So I'm charmed to hear Mario say that about me. I never thought of myself as a servant of anybody, but
it's very difficult to renounce your personality, your literary personality, in order to be an efficient translator.
well, that's why it's so hard to translate bad writing. I much prefer to translate great writing, because that resonates with me.
Right. So Mario, you've indicated a little bit about your feelings about translators, but how in general do writers feel about translators? Not you about Edith in particular, but just in general. How is there a natural affiliation? Is there a gratitude there? Is there a frustration at times? What how do you think?
Let me tell you, Maria, I am terrified with translators, particularly since I received the visit of a Russian woman, a young woman who was having I think a doctorate in Moscow University, and she came to see me, and she told me something which was terrifying. She told me, you know that your translations into Russian are absolutely awful, because they are done by different translators. And what I have discovered reading these translations is that the mistakes are so enormous that most of your novels translated into Russian are absolutely failures And from the literary point of view, I was never contacted by my Russian translators. I've seen the books. I have received the books. But the translators apparently never had problems with my books, my novels, and I understood exactly why after talking with this. And since then, you know, I have many anecdotes about my translations. For example, my first novel, The City and the Dogs, was translated into Sweden. And I was told by a Spanish that had been teaching in Sweden, and that he spoke very good Swedish, I suppose. And he told me, you know that in your novel, in the Swedish language, when the young cadets smoke, they smoke marijuana. I said, what? There is no marijuana in my first novel, not at all. Nobody smokes marijuana. And he told me, probably, as there are so many brutal things in your first novel, the translator thought that when the cadets smoke, they smoke something very audacious, and so they smoke marijuana. So the Swedish readers of my first novel have a very absurd idea of the cadets, because at that time in Peru, I think nobody smoked marijuana, you know?
No.
So my impression is that when I discover a new translator, I am usually terrified, you know? Not with Edith, of course. No, that I am totally reassured.
So Edith, how would you characterize your profession? Are you a writer? Are you an avatar? Are you a ventriloquist? Are you to my mind, you have to be a writer. You are a writer. You are a writer who actually has linguistic abilities to carry a language from one culture to another culture. And I say that you're not just bringing it into a language, you're bringing it into a culture, because it's a whole apparatus that you're doing.
Wasn't it Ezra Pound who said, every time I hear the word culture, I pull out my pistol?
Oh, okay. Fix that for me.
A Nazi leader, you know?
Well, I don't know about cultures. I translate languages. I don't know if I'm translating cultures. I don't even know what that means.
But don't you think, Edith, that a language is not just a collection of words? There are feelings, there are sentiments, there are passions, there are obsessions, and you translate all this with the words, with the there is a complex collection of feelings and intuitions, and also a way to understand nature and society and other people and the tradition, and so you use words to express all these complex apparatus. Huh?
I only translate what the writer writes. So if the writer understands all of those things, if the author, the first author, understands all those things, then my job as a translator is to bring that into English. But I don't know, I don't want to be grandiose in talking about what I do.
Well, no, not grandiose, but you have problems, you know, with words. You use words trying to use everything that those words represent or implicate, feelings. I think, for example, comparing the Spanish that we talk in Peru and with the Spanish that is talked in Spain, there are enormous differences, and particularly in the Peruvian Spanish, I think a psychological quality which is largely shared by Peruvians is represented, impregnated, and this is timidity, the shyness of Peruvians in comparison with the quality of the Spaniards who are so convinced of what they believe and what they do, and in Peru, you are never so convinced of what you are doing. You are hesitating all the time, and we are using Spanish and Peruvian writers the same words to express very different kind of feelings,
I don't have anything to say about that.
I have a feeling that it's just so intuitive for you, Edith, that it's just second nature for you to do that. I'm really struck by the fact that you both are interested and have said you've been interested in the same writers, the same literary figures. You share an interest in Madame Bovary, for instance, or in Anna Karenina, or in Don Quixote. And there's a kind of common, and I wonder if that sort of affiliation helps in the process of translation.
Are you asking me? Is that addressed to me?
Just some comment on the ways that that your tastes and Mario's tastes happen to align, which interests me a lot.
Well, there's a part of me, Marie, that wants to say that if you don't love Don Quixote, you shouldn't have anything to do with literature. I think Don Quixote is the greatest book that's ever been written in any language that I know of. And everyone who reads loves it. And I've read it, I don't know how many times, and each time I read it, it's a brand new experience for me. Flaubert, Madame Bovary, it's one of the most stunning novels that was ever written. I can't remember the third book. You mentioned the third one, and I don't recall what
Anna
it was.
Karenina.
Yes, well, how can I forget Tolstoy? Yes, I mean, these two women, Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina, defined the sensibility of the 19th century. They are astonishing characters. And so, as I said, it's sort of like saying that you like Shakespeare or that you like Cervantes. How can you not like Emma Bovary or Anna Karenina?
Yeah, and yet there are very strong differences between them. I should also mention William Faulkner, who was very influential in Mario's life, and you deal with that Faulkner influence in many of the writers that you've translated, Edith. And there is a kind of there's a permeable quality to literature in a way that when you think about it, that Faulkner influences Mario influences a Danish writer or a Romanian writer, and there is a sort of this permeability to language in general and translations in general. I'm thinking, of course, of your book. This is Why Translation Matters. This happens to be a page proof of it, which I got about 10 years ago. It's a stunning.
I didn't recognize the cover.
It's an extraordinary book, and anybody who's interested in translation should read it. But it's in there. You talk about the sort of the fundamental love and respect for great literature that brings you to the table to do the work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that there are those common interests make you a literary translator, whereas other translators who might just be doing words, moving words from one language to another, there's a very different quality in the way that you approach the literature that you translate. So,
Marie, flattery will get you anything you want. You know that. That's very kind of you to say
Let me tell
that.
you what happened to me with Madame Bovary. I read it. I bought the book the day I arrived in France. That was at the end of August 1968, I think. And I was so impressed that I read the novel the whole night. And I finished the novel the next day. And for me was extremely important as a writer to discover this novel, because this novel showed to me that it was possible the kind of literature that I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to do it. At that time, it was very popular in Latin America among writers, the realism. But the realism that was practiced by Latin American writers was a kind of literature that was very poor from a literary point of view, from an artistic point of view. And I wanted to be a realist writer, but I didn't like the kind of realism that was practiced in Latin America. On the contrary, my impression was that the realism was not incompatible with elegance, with even preciosity, with a literary kind of texts that at the same time that express a real world would be beautiful and very attractive and very original from a literary point of view. And this was Madame Bovary for me, a realist story in which elegance was present in every phrase of the novel. And I started to read Flaubert immediately, the letters and or the novels, and I thought that Flaubert was a fantastic influence to the kind of writer that I wanted to be. He had managed to produce, novels that were realists, as Madame Bovary or L'Éducation sentimentale, que at the same time were masters of aesthetic values, and so it was not incompatible, the realism with the beauty, with the elegance, with even the preciosity of a language, of a style. And since then, I think I have been very humbled each time that I have read Flaubert, because he has been, in a way, my master, someone who told me to produce a realistic literature that was not devoid of aesthetic values.
Were you reading Flaubert in French or in Spanish, Mario?
In French. I was a very French admirer at that time when I went to the university, and at the same time I went to learn French. And after a few months, I could read French. I thought I could read French. When I arrived in France, my French was not very understandable for the French people. But I read a lot when I was young in French, yes.
Well, this is the magic, of course, because you could read French, you could appreciate Flaubert in the original, and so many cannot. And so, for instance, you must have read William Faulkner initially in Spanish,
In
right?
Spanish, yes.
In
And
the
I
Spanish
learned
translation.
to read Faulkner, yes.
In Spanish, and he had a wonderful translator in Spanish, and this is why he influenced so many people in Spanish. And so that act of leaping across a language and appreciating another sensibility was easy for you in French, but not so easy for others who need the translators. And that, of course, is where the importance and the unifying force of translation comes into play. I think of one of the most important things I think that Edith says in her book, Why Translation Matters, is because, I mean, how could we possibly understand, for instance, the spirit or the sort of the culture, I'm sorry to use that word, Edith, of, let's say, the Japanese, if we could not read Haruki Murakami in a translation, right? And it's that translation that brings us, that has us leap across those frontiers and those borders to understand a different kind of sensibility. I was really struck, Edith, by what you just said earlier about you hear a voice when you read a book that you are about to translate, and you actually hear a voice and it almost inhabits your head. And I want you to talk a little bit more about that voice that you hear.
Well, it's not only a book that I'm going to translate, it's any book that I read. When I read, I hear the language in my head as I'm reading. And I don't know if that's because I'm a poor reader. I don't know what it means, but I do hear a voice when I read. And as the voice speaks, and if I'm translating, I try to speak in English what the voice in my head is speaking in Spanish, if that makes any sense.
It makes absolutely perfect sense to me. And here I'd like to tell our audience a little bit about the Palabra archives at the Library of Congress, in which you can actually hear the voices of hundreds of Spanish and Portuguese language authors reading from their work. And the archives date back to, I think it's 1943. And they include a stunning number of great artists. Mario, of course, is part of the Palabra archives because he recorded at the Library of Congress a number of times, I think, but also Gabriela Mistral and Pablo Neruda, Jorge Luis Borges, Cortázar, Julio Cortázar is there, Jorge Amado. So there's hundreds of really great writers in this great collection at the Library of Congress, given to us by the Hispanic Reading Room. And I just want to play with you a little bit, Edith and Mario, by playing 3 recordings from the Palabra archives, and they're recordings just so that our audience can hear perhaps in a way what Edith is saying, that you actually hear very different voices in the words and stories that are being told. These are 30-second recordings, and the first one is Gabriel Garcia Marquez reading from Autumn of the Patriarch, which he recorded in 1977. Let's hear that now.
Y a las voces insepultas, el horror de las miradas póstumas que acechaban por las cerraduras, el rastro de sus grandes patas de saurio moribundo en el pantano humeante de las últimas ciénagas de salvación de la casa en tinieblas.
And that was, as I say, Gabo Garcia Marquez reading from Autumn of the Patriarch. And now listen to Laura Restrepo reading from her novel Delirio, which was translated as Delirium. This is a recording from 2015.
Supe que había sucedido algo irreparable en el momento en que un hombre me abrió la puerta de esa habitación de hotel y vi a mi mujer sentada al fondo mirando por la ventana de muy extraña manera. Fui a mi regreso de un viaje corto, solo 4 días por cosas de trabajo, dice Aguilar, y asegura que al partir la dejó bien. Cuando me fui no le pasaba nada raro, o al menos nada que fuera fuera de lo habitual. Ciertamente nada que anunciara lo que iba a sucederle durante mi ausencia, salvo sus propias premoniciones, claro está.
Laura Restrepo with Delirium. And now I want you to hear Mario. This was recorded way back in 1977, Mario. It's you reading from Tia Julia, from Aunt Julia and the scriptwriter.
Le pusieron Ceferino para halagar a su padrino de bautizo, un portero del Congreso que llevaba ese nombre y los 2 apellidos de la madre. En su niñez, nada permitió adivinar que sería cura, porque lo que le gustaba no eran las prácticas piadosas, sino bailar trompos y volar cometas. Pero siempre, aún antes de saber hablar, demostró ser persona de carácter.
So these three examples, which to my mind show you a great spectrum, really. I mean, there's that mesmerizing quality of Garcia Marquez. There is a kind of intimate quality to Restrepo, very intimate, almost as if she's in the room with you. With Mario, it's this unbelievably crisp, defined narrative that is very clear and very sharp and reportorial. And I just want to talk about those voices and the how you slip in and out of them in your ability to go from, say, from Mario's work to Cervantes's work to Garcia Marquez's work to Muñoz Molina's work, Edith, and the different voices you inhabit.
Well, the joke is I do that with difficulty. I don't know quite how to answer the question, Marie. I think I begin each book as if I had never read another book and never heard, I'm sorry, never heard another voice. And I begin fresh with each author and with each book. And I think you have to do that because Mario may disagree, but I think an author's voice changes from book to book. It doesn't stay the same. It's not a constant. And what I hear is not so much the physical voice of the author as the voice speaking the novel, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
That makes sense, Edith. But let me ask you a question. I'm very curious about what you said, that when you read a book, you discover a voice. Is that common? It happens always, or in certain cases, the voices are dissipated, the voices are confused, mixed with other voices that you have in your memory?
Well, it only happens with good books. I don't hear voices if I am unfortunate enough to read a poor novel. But I do hear a voice in my head when I read something that I really like and value. And I think that voice exists alone, and it's the voice of the book in my mind. I'm not sure if that makes much sense, but I do hear the book.
Well, what you say about voices having different authors having different voices is so true. I mean, with Mario, I mean the narrator in Death in the Andes and the narration in Death in the Andes is so different from The Bad Girl or Cinque Esquinas or the neighborhood, and very different from conversation in the cathedral. Those voices are all very different, and yet they are all Vargas Llosa. Edith, you need to enter each one on its own terms, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I guess we're all carnival characters and we put on different masks depending on what we're doing.
Right, right.
Absolutely. You know, there are different voices because the people who are expressing themselves are from different regions in which we talk about different ways, you know, and if you go from Cusco to Lima and to Lima from Lima to Piura, you have three different voices which are so different that they seem, you know, different versions of the Spanish language. You know, the Spanish from the Andes is very different from the Spanish of the coastal region in Peru. The coastal region Spanish is much more humorous, for example, than the Indian Spanish, which is very severe, you know, very intimate, you know, and so you cannot give the kind of Spanish of the coastal region to a Cusqueño or to Arequipeño, because they are completely different, you know, in spite of the fact that we speak the same Spanish, you know, which is more or less the original Spanish, you know.
That's so true with the dialects, because, you know, I'm thinking for someone who is Peruvian, and that Miraflores dialect, you know, that's way that the Miraflorinos speak, and you capture it, Mario, and somehow Edith manages to get it into English, which is some prestidigitation that we will never understand, but that magic happens in Edith's voice in her head somehow. It must be really difficult with slang, however, Edith. I mean, there's how do you do slang? There are untranslatable words, right?
Oh, see, I don't believe that. I believe all words are translatable.
Mhm.
And I'm helped by the fact that English is a very slangy language, and we have all kinds of colloquial ways of saying things.
I'm thinking, Mario, you'll appreciate this. I'm thinking of the word huachafo in Peruvian Spanish.
Difficult to translate, you know, huachafo.
How do you translate huachafo? Huachafo is meant to be someone who is pretentious beyond, you know, his social station, well, how would you translate huachafo in one word? It'd be difficult.
It is very difficult because there are no words in English. My impression is that there are no words in English that express huachafo. The huachafo is something very complicated. You know, I think it's a vision of society. It's also a language in which you communicate, you know, your feelings, your sentiments, and but at the same time, there is some poverty of the quality of the language in the huachafo expression, you know, and so it's a caricature in a way. It can be very caricatural, the huachafo language, but at the same time, is the language in which we express musically, for instance, in the valses, in the guainitos, in the marineras, you know, the best music of Peru, you know,
Yeah.
and it's music, huachafa music, you know.
Right. Well, I'm sure Edith would pull out the right American slang to.
You just have to give me a minute or two to figure it out.
I want to talk about, in closing, about the attitudes of publishers to translators, because I think this is something that you've spoken about quite a bit, Edith, that in Europe and Latin America, for instance, 25% to 40% of all published works in those areas in Europe and Latin America are actually translations. They're translations from other languages. In the United States of America, the percentage is very, very low. 3% of all published works in this country are translations. So this fever that you have, Edith, to bring to sort of cross those boundaries and bring great works into the English language that you wouldn't be able to read otherwise from Spanish, is actually practiced very little. There is a very small percentage, and publishers are very wary of publishing translations because they're never sure whether they will sell. I think that a lot of that was broken. That ceiling was broken by the Latin American boom, of which Mario was a part, in which suddenly we were getting these translations by you and Rabasa and Helen Lane and others who were bringing a great quantity of Latin American writers into the English language. But do you feel there is still a resistance? What would you say about the status of publishing translations now?
I think that's reduced a great deal. Publishers never would put the translator's name on the cover to try to hide the fact that the book was a translation. And I had a wonderful, feisty lawyer back in the day who would do my contract, and he would fight very hard to get my name on the cover under the author's name. And I think that broke a precedent in the United States, and now translators usually have their names on the covers under the author's name. And that was going on the assumption that buyers would not buy a book if they knew it was a translation. So the publishers were trying to present translated works as if they had originally been written in English, or some bizarre idea like that. But I don't think that's been the case for quite a few years.
Mario, do you have comments on that?
Well, I think it's very important to read translations, particularly because I think literature is exactly this, the possibility of known different ways of expression in the order of imagination, of invention, I think in the United States, the problem is reduced because the different kind of people who arrived in the United States and who usually are attached to their origins. So they have this, let's say, world view of the world. And but in a country, let's say that Sweden or Holland, or the only way in which you can translate yourself to different countries, to different kind of invention, is through translations. And that is the reason why I think the tradition of good translators is very, very important in the Swedish countries, and in general in Europe. I don't know what is the percentage of the foreign books that are reading in Europe, but my impression is that it is a larger portion of books than in America.
Yes, that's true. And an interesting sort of corollary to that is that the English translations, because English has become such a universal language, the English translation is the one on which the other translations are based. So
Mhm.
I would say when we were talking about your Russian translation and how horrible that Russian translation was, Mario, it was probably a translation that was done from,
Retranslation, a
yes, from,
retranslation from a different language. Yes.
right through another language. So the
Oh.
English language translation becomes absolutely cardinal, central to the whole process.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So if our percentages are lower in the United States of America, we're not producing enough for the rest of the world as well. I want to read just a passage that Edith wrote in her book Why Translation Matters, and it really says what you just said, Mario. Translation permits us to savor the transformation of the foreign into the familiar, and for a brief time to live outside our own skins, our own preconceptions and misconceptions. It expands and deepens our world, our consciousness in countless indescribable ways. And I think, Edith, that says it all.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Marie.
So Edith, Mario, thank you so much for this wonderful
you.
opportunity to talk to you and to honor Edith for her brilliant and enduring work in translation. Thank you both so much.
I hope you enjoyed that fascinating conversation. The library plans on bringing you more programs on how books go from mere ideas to published masterpieces. Please join us for more literary events, which you can learn about by going to loc.gov/engage.